Well, I am back with Kat Sterling, who just read a sample from Winnie West Has an Agenda. And my first question for you is what about the era of the turn of the 20th century, American West, specifically Seattle, drew you to write though in that setting?
I know it's super random at first glance, right? It's definitely not the typical setting for historical romance right now. Not to say there's not, other great American romances, but it all comes down to the theme. So I knew that I wanted to write about suffrage. I loved Evie Dunmore's books and, it was the era of social justice. And I thought, well, what interests me? And it was women's rights. And I thought, I want to do suffrage and I want to do American suffrage. So it was really just a search of what setting and time most excited me. And I decided that national suffrage, which was passed in, 1920, was a bit too late. I didn't really want to write that far ahead. And so I was like, okay, well, what was going on in the 1800s? What was with, state suffrage? And that's how I learned that only four states had passed suffrage by, I think, 1896. And then an era called the doldrums started, where there was 14 years that passed and no suffrage was passed in any state in the United States. But things were kicking up on the West Coast. And when Washington state passed suffrage in 1910, it was kind of a domino effect for a lot of the next states. So I was like, well, that's a really cool premise, like kickstarting the movement again, having a victory. And then the more I looked at Seattle, I was like, this history is fascinating. I mean, it was the city was exploding at that point, just so much movement. I think between 1900 and 1910, the population grew. I think I wrote this down, 194%, just Seattle.
Wow.
So when I started reading about it, and I'd visited Seattle many times because my sister lived there for a decade, I just knew that it was the right place. I got excited about it and I thought there's so many stories here that haven't been told in a historical romance setting, and I'm gonna do it. So yeah, that's
Yeah.
kind of how I ended up in Seattle.
That's amazing. And something that stands out to me whenever we're encountering the suffrage movement, and it came out in the scene too where she said kiss the enemy, is that like the suffragists were very aware of how marriage was an institution that oppressed them. So I think that must be a really interesting tension to play with. How do you think about that as you're crafting your romances?
Yeah, I mean, I think that especially came out in Winnie's story because she is a widow and she was in a marriage where she was not supported in terms of wanting to be a professional, wanting to further her education. So now that she is widow, she's reclaiming her life and she's not looking for any man who at all, really, and especially any man who doesn't support her newfound freedom. So there's definitely a tug and pull of that throughout this book, that kind of how do I live for me while still embracing that I deserve love and I can find happiness in this new place. So, yeah, it's a very interesting concept because I also don't really want to write misogynistic heroes. It's just not my cup of tea. I don't mind if they make, the occasional foot and mouth kind of statement, but I didn't want to convert anybody. I wanted there to be reasons for what they were doing, but overall for them to support a woman's right to vote, no matter their background, no matter their circumstance. So
Yeah.
all of my heroes will have that kind of attitude in this series. Yeah.
Have you found examples of men in the historical record who supported the right to vote?
Yeah, yes. So, for example, with the Seattle movement, there were plenty of examples of men going to speak for women in like kind of male-led areas, like different labor groups or in government, etc. So there are a lot of accounts of men working beside women. And actually, in my book, in Winnie West, she goes to a suffrage kind of conference, if you will, out in the countryside. And I do make sure to show that there were men attending these talks as well, that they were interested in supporting the women as well.
I like that. I mean, so often we get pushback when we write heroines who are too liberal minded, but I also sometimes feel in myself giving pushback, but also I think seeing pushback of like, well, men wouldn't be thinking that way because why would they be? So it's nice to kind of know that it's not just wishful thinking that these heroes existed.
No, not at all. And I do try to base a lot, if not all of the stories I write in real history. Obviously we can push the boundaries a little bit or color within the lines kind of thing. But I've done such a deep dive into what went on at that time, and I have so many examples of things that really happened, either in Washington or in a different state. And then from there, it's easy to concoct a fictional scene or setting.